I was told I would get nothing from my dad's $40 million will, and my stepmom sat there glowing with joy, waiting to watch me fall apart. But then the lawyer read one sentence that flipped the room upside down, and in that moment, I smiled, because finally, the truth was louder than her cruelty. Stories like this are why I share my voice here, because if my story touches you in any way, a like or comment truly keeps me going, reminding me these stories matter and that we are in this together. My name is Amelia, I am 33, and if you had met me a few years ago, you might have thought I was one of those women who kept her life neat and predictable, always on time, never making waves. I lived simply, with a modest job as a project manager, a small rented apartment, and a rattling car. But I never complained, because my father raised me to value every earned coin and every honest effort. My father, Richard, was larger than life, not for his height or voice, but for the empire he built from almost nothing. He wore the same watch for 20 years, packed his own lunch, and told me every Sunday that fairness mattered more than fortune. When I was little, our house smelled of coffee and fresh bread. Weekends meant grocery runs, park walks, and evenings with old sitcom reruns. My mother passed when I was very young, so my father kept our small world alive with his rituals, and for years we were a quiet but steady team of two, until the day he met Vanessa, and everything began to shift. Vanessa was everything I was not, polished and perfect, speaking like every word was staged and tilting her head at the exact angle to capture attention. My father, lonely after years of only work, and me, saw in her a second chance. But for me, she was a storm with lightning under her smile. I remember her first dinner at our home, how she scanned the room like a place she didn't belong, how she barely touched her food, laughed at my father's stories, but rolled her eyes when he turned away, and how she asked about my work, only to give me the polite nod you give a child with a silly dream. That night I felt small, invisible, like a guest in my own house. The months that followed erased the life I knew. Photos of my mother vanished from the walls, dinners became Vanessa's stage, and she mocked me in front of relatives, calling me the guest in this house, while my father stayed silent, torn between love for me and his need for peace. I told myself it was temporary, but people like Vanessa thrive on control, and soon she managed his calendar, intercepted his calls, and twisted my words into something selfish. I can still hear her smirk when I shared finishing a project at work, and my father proudly said, "That's my girl." She added, "Even small jobs deserve applause," and while she meant it as a joke, the sting stayed, and that night I sat in my car and cried, feeling like a stranger in the house where I had grown up. Looking back, those moments were the start of a story that twisted into something far bigger than I could imagine. I didn't know then that my father had already anticipated the storm, that he had hidden something deep in his will to one day protect me. All I knew was that I was being erased piece by piece, and the woman doing it wore expensive perfume and smiled as she did it. Yet even now I smile, because for every cruel word she spoke, for every time she tried to cut me out, my father was writing something stronger, something she could never erase, and the day the will was read, that truth finally stepped into the light. I have always seen myself as the kind of woman who planted both feet firmly on the ground, someone who worked hard, saved carefully, and never expected life to hand her anything unearned. At 33, I carried that quiet pride even when the world seemed determined to test it. My career was not glamorous but steady, managing projects for a logistics firm that valued detail and persistence, and I found comfort in calendars, budgets, and checklists because they made sense when people often did not. Friends teased me for being too responsible, the one who left parties early, but I wore that reputation like armor, and my father always said I reminded him of his younger self. My father, Richard, was the cornerstone of my life, the man who taught me that fairness was not just an idea but a responsibility, that money without integrity was only numbers. He built his empire with long nights and honest contracts, and though he ended up with wealth most people could never dream of, he still packed his own lunch, clipped coupons, and washed his car by hand every Saturday. Growing up in that world shaped me to resist the glitter of shallow games, because I had already seen what real value looked like, and it was not hidden in brands or status, but in the way you treated those who depended on you. That was why Vanessa and I clashed, because she embodied the opposite of my father's values, presenting herself like a polished product, every smile rehearsed, every word tilted to her favor. She treated humility as weakness, mocked my simple wardrobe and my practical car, and made sly comments that stung over time. If my father loved me for my sincerity, Vanessa despised me for it, and she worked to frame me as unworthy of standing in the world he built. I knew who I was, yet her shadow chipped away at my certainty until I wondered if she was right, not realizing my father already saw through her mask, quietly preparing something that would protect me long after he was gone, writing my strength into his legacy while she mocked me for being ordinary. The change did not explode overnight. It crept in quietly like a draft through a cracked window, faint at first until the air in the house grew cold in ways I could no longer ignore. It began with the walls, with the disappearance of photographs that once told our story, vacations and holidays vanishing one by one. My mother's portrait above the fireplace, a frame I had dusted since childhood, was replaced without a word by a sterile vase that matched the glossy furniture Vanessa ordered. When I asked timidly if she had moved it for safekeeping, she smiled and said certain things no longer fit the aesthetic, as if my mother's memory were a decoration to discard. My father looked uneasy, fidgeting with his coffee cup, but said nothing, and in that silence I felt the first sting of being erased. At family gatherings, the cuts grew sharper, aimed directly at me, yet disguised as jokes. Once, while serving dessert, she announced brightly that I was really just a guest in this house now, and the room laughed while her eyes glinted with intent. Another time, after I proudly shared about finishing a project ahead of schedule, she smiled sweetly and called it a little job, and relatives chuckled as if it were playful, while my cheeks burned with shame. Her words were knives slipped beneath laughter, and no one defended me, not even my father, who sat in silence, torn between his love for me and his fear of conflict. It wasn't only her words, it was the slow pattern of exclusion that shaped how others saw me too. Invitations stopped arriving, dinners were rescheduled without notice, and conversations shifted when I entered a room. She introduced me with lines like, "She does her best," or "She's very sweet, not business-minded," planting seeds that I was fragile and unimportant. What hurt most was knowing my father saw it. I could read the guilt in his eyes when he looked at me across the table, but instead of stopping her, he chose peace, and in that choice I felt abandoned by the one person who had always been my anchor. I told myself his happiness was worth my discomfort, that silence was sacrifice, but the more I rationalized, the more I dissolved into someone smaller, hesitant and fragile in ways I had never been. I would sit in my car before dinners, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, bracing for whatever remark she would throw. She never raised her voice, never left proof of cruelty, always striking in ways no one else could call out without seeming paranoid. It was warfare I wasn't prepared for, a slow erosion of dignity that left me lonelier than ever, not only because she hurt me, but because she convinced everyone else to laugh while she did it. When my father's health began to fail, the house no longer felt like mine, even though my name and memories lived in every corner. Vanessa tightened her grip on everything, managing his calendar so completely that I needed her permission to see him, intercepting calls and screening visitors. If I protested, she reminded me that stress was bad for him, and that it was better if I stayed away. My father, frail and weary, let her run the show, too tired to fight, or believing peace was easier than conflict. My visits shrank to short moments under her watchful eye, always interrupted, always timed, until I felt like a burden instead of a daughter. When he passed, I thought grief would unite us, but even the funeral became her stage. She arrived in a designer black dress and pearls, sighing dramatically as though she alone carried sorrow. As I stood by the casket, she leaned close, whispering, "Now everything is mine." Her words froze me in place, cruel and triumphant, a declaration of victory at the very moment I said goodbye. No one else heard, no one else saw, and I swallowed the bitterness alone, my grief tangled with fury I could not show. Within days, she stripped the house of his essence, boxing up books, selling heirlooms, even sending away his favorite leather chair, the one he had read to me in as a child, dismissing it as just old furniture. What made it unbearable was the way she performed for others, carrying herself as the grieving widow who had sacrificed everything while I was pushed to the margins. She hosted board members, speaking of continuing his vision, dismissing me as someone still adjusting. At church, people whispered about her elegance, one woman even saying, "She really was his everything." I wanted to scream she wasn't, that she had stolen the role and rewritten the script. But my voice felt small against the tide of her performance. Alone in my car afterward, I clenched the steering wheel and thought, if this is how it looks now, what will happen when the will is read? One evening, while alone in my father's study, I found something that shifted the air beneath me. A yellow post-it tucked inside the cracked binding of his favorite ethics book, his handwriting small and neat, with a file name and a date just before his last hospital stay. It led me to a backup drive hidden in the bottom drawer, and as I opened the folder under the glow of the desk lamp, I discovered not ordinary legal minutiae, but a memo that read, like his moral code, turned into law. Phrases like stewardship clause and character triggers tied distributions to dignity and care for family, and with every line, I read a stubborn flame of hope, grew stronger that he had not left our future to chance, but had built protections against vanity and ambition. The next day that flame hardened when I overheard Vanessa in the kitchen, her voice loud and theatrical, telling a friend she would see me walk away with nothing, like a stray dog from a market stall. The cruelty stung, but it also exposed her blind arrogance, the kind that never prepares for consequences. If my father had indeed left guardrails in place, her overconfidence could be her undoing. Instead of crumbling, I began to plan quietly. The way my father always planned his business moves, steady, patient, waiting for the right moment. Over the weeks, I became a quiet detective in the house that smelled of both his cologne and her perfume, searching corners I had once ignored, lifting photo backs, tracing email chains. I found notes to his attorney insisting on a neutral firm, drafts for a family foundation prioritizing mentorships over prestige, and reminders in his hand, values, not vanity. With each document copied and saved, each email printed and time-stamped, hope steadied into certainty. He had built a trap for anyone who placed self-interest above decency, and realizing that gave me a composure I had not felt in months, the calm of knowing he had prepared for this storm. Yet doubt still whispered in quiet hours. What if the memo was a draft? What if her lawyer rewrote the terms? So I tested the edges cautiously. I reached out to an attorney my father once trusted, a plain-spoken woman from his board, and asked about the language I had found. Her interest grew as she explained how stewardship clauses allowed trustees to withhold distributions based on conduct. She urged me to preserve the files, gather witnesses, and safeguard copies, and I felt panic ease into purpose. Night after night I worked in my small kitchen, copying files, writing down dates and cruelties, building a map of Vanessa's pattern of exclusion. By the time the coffee in my mug had gone cold, I knew I was ready to tell the story that would reveal her greed and prove that what my father valued was stronger than her performance of grandeur. Once I realized my father had left more than money behind, I knew I could no longer be the passive daughter while Vanessa rewrote our history. At night, I copied every file onto multiple drives, hiding them with friends, in a deposit box, and online. I filled a notebook with dates, names, and every humiliation she delivered, because once written down, they stopped looking like jokes and became a pattern. Writing gave me calm, as though I reclaimed a piece of myself each time her cruelty turned into evidence. Quietly, I reached out to people who had known my father before her. Over coffee, Mr. Collins, his old attorney, spoke about Richard's insistence on fairness and neutral firms to prevent manipulation. Two former board members confirmed he often spoke of guardrails in both business and family, proof he had seen the same dangers I now faced. Their words steadied me. I was not imagining things. He had prepared for this storm. While I built my case, I practiced composure in the mirror, training myself not to flinch or rise to Vanessa's bait. Every insult became another receipt to save for later. Every boast another brick in the cliff she was building beneath herself. If I doubted, I remembered my father's note, values, not vanity, and knew this fight was about dignity, not just inheritance. By the time the will reading approached, I no longer trembled when she entered the room. I had files, witnesses, and the quiet knowledge that justice was already written into his words. The morning of the reading carried a silence heavier than grief, thick with greed and suspicion. I arrived early, clutching my folder, though I knew I might not need it. Vanessa swept in late, draped in black silk and sunglasses, flanked by her brother and two board members. In the conference room, Mr. Collins sat at the oak table with the weary patience of a man who had seen families torn apart by paper. Vanessa placed herself at the center seat, smiled wide, and before anything began, she declared, "I was everything to Richard, unlike some who barely played a role." The words burned, but I stayed calm, sipping my coffee, knowing her arrogance would soon be shattered by the very sentence she never saw coming. Relatives shifted uneasily, board members cleared their throats, and Mr. Collins adjusted his glasses, ignoring Vanessa's jab as he prepared his notes. The silence felt like the pause before a storm, everyone waiting to see who would win. Vanessa leaned back, certain of her triumph, her smile wide as if the reading would crown her queen. For a moment doubt coiled in my stomach, whispering that maybe all my searching had been illusions. But I clung to my father's words, values, not vanity, and held on like to a lifeline. When Mr. Collins began, his voice steady, he listed distributions of assets, trusts, and foundations exactly as Vanessa expected. With every sentence her smile widened, her eyes flicking toward the board members in smug victory. For a heartbeat, my chest tightened with panic, but I knew my father's legacy wasn't so simple. I sat still, hands folded, waiting for the moment I was sure would come, the one that would wipe the smugness from her painted face. Then he paused, adjusted his glasses, and read a sentence that split the room like thunder. Any beneficiary who mocked, intimidated, or isolated his daughter Amelia within 30 days of his passing would forfeit her share, with the trustee deciding. Silence fell so heavy I heard the air conditioner hum. Vanessa froze, her smile stiff, her finger no longer tapping, her eyes darting for escape from words carved in ink. Power surged through me for the first time in months, a quiet vindication rising from the page. And then came the final blow. The trustee chosen to enforce these terms was not a stranger, but me. I sat still, lips curved in the faintest smile, while inside my heart roared with victory. The board members straightened, Vanessa's brother stopped smirking, and Vanessa herself went pale beneath her makeup, stripped of her confidence. My father had given me more than money, he had given me justice. And as silence stretched, I savored the irony that the woman who mocked me now sat powerless under the weight of a single sentence that turned the entire story upside down. The silence stretched until Mr. Collins calmly unfolded another folder, his voice steady as he explained that independent verification of conduct had already begun. He laid out testimony from staff who had heard Vanessa's cruel remarks, emails where she mocked my grief, and texts boasting that I would walk away with nothing but tears. Each page was a spotlight cutting through her carefully constructed shadow, and the room grew colder as the evidence mounted, board members shifting in their seats to distance themselves from her collapsing image. As the words filled the room, I sat straighter, no longer shrinking into the background. There were emails where she called me too weak and naive to fight, messages bragging she had smoothed things with the right people, and even a voice recording where she sneered that I was a parasite feeding off Richard's guilt. The insults I had carried in silence were now undeniable, her own words echoing as evidence, and instead of shame, I felt the calm weight of validation. Vanessa's face drained of color, her posture folding as her performance unraveled. She tried to protest, insisting remarks were jokes taken out of context, but the desperation in her voice betrayed her. Mr. Collins continued, pointing to the clause giving me, as trustee, full discretion. Even if there had been doubt, the final judgment was mine. The power she had flaunted over me was gone, replaced with the reality that her cruelty had disqualified her from the fortune she believed was guaranteed. Looking at her, I felt sorrow for the years lost, yet satisfaction at the irony. She had tried to erase me, calling me small and unworthy, and it was those very actions that erased her instead. My father's plan worked flawlessly, turning her arrogance into her undoing. Justice did not roar, it arrived in the quiet weight of documented receipts, in words she could not deny, leaving her powerless, while I finally understood that dignity had been my inheritance all along. The moment the last piece of evidence was read aloud, I felt the air in the room change in a way that was almost physical, as if the walls themselves had shifted to mark the turning of the tide. For months, I had been shrinking under Vanessa's shadow, letting her sharpen her voice against me, but now it was she who sat frozen, her painted confidence cracking like cheap porcelain under the weight of truth. Her brother, who had walked into the room smirking, now leaned back uncomfortably, his eyes avoiding mine, while the board members who had once nodded toward her with polite approval were suddenly clearing their throats, glancing down at their papers, and subtly inching their chairs away from her. It was a small detail, but I noticed it, and in that moment I realized the balance of power had shifted completely. Not just legally, but socially. The room no longer belonged to her. Vanessa tried to recover, to claw back her dignity with excuses that sounded rehearsed even to her own ears, claiming that her words had been taken out of context, that she was grieving and did not mean what she said, but the weakness in her tone betrayed her. The woman who had once whispered poison with perfect precision now stumbled over her own sentences, her eyes darting desperately toward anyone who might still believe her, and finding none. Each attempt she made to paint herself as misunderstood only deepened the silence around her, and I sat calmly, no longer needing to defend myself because she was unraveling in front of everyone without my help. The contrast between who I had been and who I was in that moment struck me sharply. I had walked into the room bracing myself for humiliation, and now I sat steady, watching her fight a battle she could no longer win. For the first time, I allowed myself to look directly at her without fear, holding her gaze long enough to see the panic behind her eyes. And I understood then that humiliation was not loud or dramatic. It was quiet, the kind of silence that follows when a liar realizes everyone has stopped believing them. The same woman who once called me weak, who told relatives I was a guest in my own father's house, now looked like a guest herself, an unwanted one, sitting on borrowed power that had just been stripped away. I thought about all the times I had sat in my car before dinners, dreading her comments, gripping the steering wheel until my hands ached, and I let the memory wash through me, not with pain this time, but with a deep, satisfying release. I was no longer the one holding my breath. She was. What struck me most was how natural the reversal felt once it happened, how easily the roles swapped when the truth was finally brought into the open. I had always believed strength meant raising your voice, but in that room I learned that sometimes strength is the calm you hold while someone else collapses under the weight of their own choices. Vanessa looked smaller than I had ever seen her, her expensive clothes and perfect hair powerless to protect her from the reality pressing down on her, and for the first time in years, I felt tall again. My father had not just left me an inheritance, he had left me the power to reclaim my dignity, and as the realization settled over me, I understood that this was the true gift he had hidden all along. Not money, not property, but the chance to stand strong in a room where I had once been made to feel weak. In the days and weeks that followed the will reading, the impact of that single sentence spread like ripples across a pond. touching every corner of the world my father had built and dismantling the illusions Vanessa had clung to so tightly. Her discretionary share, the fortune she had bragged about and counted on as though it were already in her bank account, evaporated before her eyes, locked behind clauses that left me holding the key, and no amount of pleading, threatening, or posturing could undo it. I watched her stumble from lawyer to lawyer, desperate for someone to tell her she still had a chance, only to hear the same conclusion again and again, that her own words, her own cruelty, had barred her from the treasure chest she had thought belonged to her. It was not loud or cinematic. There were no fireworks, no shouting matches. Instead, it was quiet and methodical, the slow collapse of a tower built on arrogance, and the silence of her defeat was more satisfying than any dramatic confrontation ever could have been. Meanwhile, I turned my attention to the house, the place that had felt like a museum curated by someone who never belonged there, and I began to breathe life back into it. The shelves filled once again with my father's books, the walls returned to holding family photographs that told the story of decades, and the sterile glass vases she had scattered everywhere were replaced by the comfortable clutter of memory. I retrieved the old leather chair she had tried to sell, the one that had creaked under my father's weight as he read me bedtime stories, and when I sat in it for the first time in years, I felt an overwhelming sense of continuity, as though time had bent to reassure me that some things could be reclaimed even after loss. Walking through the rooms, I felt the contrast between what she had tried to create, a showroom of her ego, and what now existed again, a home of warmth, history, and belonging. Every picture rehung was not just decoration but defiance, a way of saying she had failed to erase us. Vanessa's life, by contrast, became smaller with every passing week, her world shrinking in proportion to the power she had lost. Though she was not left penniless, my father's fairness would never have allowed cruelty. What she received was so tightly restricted that it could not buy her the influence or admiration she craved. She had money, but no access, funds, but no freedom, and the irony was sharp. She had mocked me for being plain, for lacking glamour, yet now she was the one quietly avoided at luncheons, whispered about in grocery aisles, and politely excluded from the very circles she once flaunted. Her fall was not about material loss, but about reputation, about the way people looked at her now, seeing not the elegant widow but the woman whose greed had undone her. And while she tried to maintain appearances, there was a hollowness in her smile, a visible tension in her posture, as though she knew the mask no longer fit. For me, the aftermath was not about standing over her ashes, but about walking freely out of the fire, about reclaiming a life I had almost lost to her shadow. I invested my energy into the foundation my father had dreamed of, channeling funds into scholarships for students who reminded me of the hard work